Good evening. This is Business Today on ChannelEye. On this program, we talk about business and entrepreneurship in Sri Lanka. On today's episode, we are joined with a medical professional to speak a bit about a new technology which could save dozens of lives. And to talk so and to discuss these topics, we have with us Dr. Sapna Nangia, the Senior Consultant of Radiation Oncology of the Apollo Proton Cancer Center. Good evening, Doctor. Welcome to the program.
Good evening, Namaste and Ayubowan.
Let's start off with a brief introduction about yourself.
So I'm a radiation oncologist. I've been in the field of oncology for more than 30 years now. I post-graduated from the Sanjay Gandhi Institute of Medical Sciences at Lucknow. I have been in the field of radiation oncology in Delhi before I moved to Chennai about 4 years ago, where I look after the breast,
Right.
head and neck, skull base, and the gynae cancer services.
Okay.
And it has been my brief and sort of my area of focus to develop the proton therapy program at the Apollo Proton Cancer Center for these subsites.
Okay. Just tell us a bit about the Apollo Proton Cancer Center as well.
Surely, with pleasure. So the Apollo Proton Cancer Center started functioning in 2019. It is the first proton therapy unit in this part of the world. And when I say in this part of the world, I mean South Asia, Middle East, Southeast Asia. So for all this segment of the population, there was actually no proton therapy equipment or establishment available.
Okay.
And this came up in 2019. We have a Proteus Plus proton therapy unit, which is the third generation of proton therapy machinery. Proton therapy has been around in the world for more than 50 years. However, the earlier machines, the earlier treatment modalities were very cumbersome to use, difficult to use, which limited their application. However, for the last 10 years, a very sophisticated treatment modality called the pencil beam scanning technique has become available. And that is the unit that we have at the Apollo Proton Cancer Center. I would like to take this opportunity to mention that it's not just a proton therapy unit. It is actually a full-fledged, the Apollo Proton Cancer Center is a full-fledged cancer hospital which functions on the concept of cancer management teams. So there are identified teams where oncologists specializing in a particular disease subsite treat patients. So we have, for example, a separate breast cancer management team, a separate GI cancer management team, a separate pediatric cancer management team, head and neck cancer management team, and so on. We also have another very important aspect of the Apollo Proton Cancer Center is its focus on multidisciplinary care, which means that these cancer management teams meet often in multidisciplinary tumor boards to jointly treat patients.
Okay. And what exactly is this proton beam therapy and how is it different from normal radiation therapy?
So, to explain that, I would first like to mention that about 70% of cancer patients do require radiation at some point of time in their treatment. Now, radiation is using high energy, usually X-rays, but occasionally high energy particles to destroy the tumor.
Right.
It is done in a very sophisticated manner by using various computerized treatment programs as well as computer-controlled machinery called linear accelerator. The current generation of machines is called linear accelerators, where you direct radiation in a very accurate manner to the tumor which has been identified by the radiation oncologist on a CT scan or an MRI, right? Now this radiation, when it is traveling to the tumor, actually traverses through the body and deposits its energy in the body in regions that don't need the radiation,
Right.
What proton therapy does is, now proton therapy is a specialized form of radiation where you're actually using positively charged particles called protons. These are produced on site on a machine called a cyclotron, and then a 3 millimeter really fine beam of protons in a very computer controlled manner using various magnets and various kinds of devices is then directed very accurately to the region that needs to be treated. The unique thing about protons is that they do not traverse the body through and through.
Right.
They are deposited exactly where the tumor is, and no part of the proton travels beyond the tumor.
Right.
So because no part of the proton is traveling beyond the tumor, you are able to protect a lot of normal tissues that lie adjacent to the tumor, which means that you can reduce the side effects of treatment, right? Occasionally, if there is a very critical organ that is lying close to the tumor, for example, that critical organ could be anything. It could be some part of the brain, it could be some part of the nerve that is traveling from the eye carrying signals of vision, it could be some part of the intestine which could get severely damaged because you were going to give it a high dose of radiation. So that doesn't happen.
Right.
So you reduce the possibility of damaging a critical organ, and especially if a tumor lies very close to a critical organ, you might otherwise, with normal radiation, compromise the dose that you were going to give to the tumor. That doesn't happen, or that happens with the possibility of that happening decreases with proton therapy.
Right. And are there any specific types of cancers that you can treat with this proton beam therapy?
So I wouldn't say that there is a specific type of cancer that you can treat with proton therapy. Its application is actually widespread. So we may use it to treat brain tumors, for example, which is where it has been used for the longest, for more than, now there is about 50 years of experience of using it in brain tumors and childhood cancers. I would say there is one, the application where we would not use it at all would be what are called liquid cancers or hematological malignancies, which are basically cancers of the blood, which are usually not treated with radiation, where you would focus entirely using chemotherapy.
Okay.
However, for the other sites, the decision to use proton would be based on various aspects, mostly where you are dealing with a tumor which is limited to its site and to the lymph nodes, what is called locoregional spread. So widespread metastatic disease would not be treated, but besides that, there is really no restriction that there is a particular type of cancer only that can be treated with proton therapy.
Okay. And when it comes to this treatment, who can take it and where can they obtain it?
So, can I tell you a little bit about its application in various disease
Sure.
sites before we go to discussing how and where they can take it?
Sure, go ahead.
So, let me start with discussing first about childhood cancers. You know, childhood cancers have very good outcomes. Mm-hmm. So, these are young children who are suffering from cancer, which is of course a very unfortunate thing, but the silver lining is that these tumors respond well to treatment, and these children we have to prepare that they are going to live their full life, and we want to prepare them for a fruitful life where their treatment has not impacted their ability to lead a normal life. Right? So, for example, we don't want the radiation to reduce the hormone formation if they're getting brain tumors, treatment for brain tumors. We don't want the radiation to go to the pituitary, which is a gland close to the brain which controls all the hormones in the body. We don't want the radiation to go to their memory structures, such as the hippocampus and the temporal lobe. We don't want their school performance to be impacted, which would mean an impact on the impact on the temporal lobe or the hippocampus would mean a reduction in their IQ and reduction in their school performance. That may have some impact in their long-term ability to, lead a fruitful life, get employed, make relationships. So we want to limit the dose to these structures, which is where the role of proton therapy comes in. This is when we are talking about pediatric brain tumors, but if we are talking about pediatric extracranial tumors which are not involving the brain, we don't want any growth retardation because of the treatment of bones, for example.
Right.
So, or by impact on hormones. So again, that is where the role of proton therapy comes in. This is how proton therapy is useful in the treatment of childhood cancers.
Okay. And what about the other types of cancers, like you mentioned, head and neck and breast?
Sure. So see, we are very, very interested in both head and neck cancers and breast cancers in South Asia.
Right.
Head and neck cancers are amongst the most common cancers in a number of, South Asian countries because of the habit of chewing tobacco and because of the excessive use of tobacco. Now, head and neck cancers are mostly treated by either surgery or a combination of surgery, radiotherapy, or a combination of surgery and radiotherapy with a bit of chemotherapy thrown in, right? So radiotherapy is a very important part of this treatment. Now, when we are giving radiation to the head and neck area, you can imagine there are many important structures in the head and neck area which are very sensitive to radiation. So, for example, the inner lining of the cheek is a very sensitive structure. You know how troubled we are if we bite our tongue or bite our cheek, or say, drink something hot and then the cheek burns up from inside. So obviously, when in radiation, when the cheek or the mouth lining receive radiation, they are damaged and there can be pain, there can be discomfort, there can be infection on the raw area, there can be difficulty in swallowing, weight loss, simply because not being able to eat properly. Also a risk of hospital admissions. Similarly, there are other structures in the head and neck area which can be impacted by radiation, such as the swallowing muscles, such as the voice box, such as the lining of the throat, not just the mouth, such as the salivary glands, right? So what happens with proton therapy is that we are able to reduce the dose to all these structures, which makes this very difficult treatment less difficult, very important in certain situations. So what are these situations? In different ages, we have different implications of reducing this toxicity, right? So, for example, in a person of working age, because there's less toxicity, they are able to get back to work faster, which is important in a person who is employed. And this has been proven in a what is called randomized study, which is like the best kind of evidence or research there is, done by the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Texas. In the older age group, this is something that we have noted in our hospital. In the older age group, now old people, generally elderly people, find it difficult to take this treatment. We have to give them a gap. Sometimes they are not able to complete their treatment. What is the implication of a gap? The gap reduces the chances of cure. A gap in the treatment reduces the chances of cure. And what we have noted with proton therapy is that the gaps are less, and patients are able to complete their treatment with less discomfort, with less moderate or severe reactions in the mouth and the throat area. On the other hand, when young people get head and neck cancers, there are certain cancers such as of the salivary gland which happen in very young adults and adolescents, even people in their 20s. Now these again we have to plan for the next 40, 50 years of life. We don't want them to have a radiation-induced second cancer. There is a small risk of radiation inducing a second cancer, and we don't want them to have that, and which is where the role of proton therapy comes in.
And what is the duration of this therapy and how much does it cost?
So the duration of therapy varies from anywhere between a week to 7 weeks at our center. As you know, the Apollo Proton Cancer Center is in Chennai, and this is so far the only proton therapy center in this part of the world. We've had patients travel from Sri Lanka, from our neighboring countries such as Bangladesh, a number of patients from Middle Eastern countries. We've also had patients come to us from as far away as Australia and the UK and even Chile to take treatment in this hospital. The cost of the treatment varies depending on the site and the number of fractions, and I think that discussion would be most appropriate when we are actually talking about the disease site being treated.
Right. Now, before we wind up, I'd also like to ask you, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of this therapy?
So the advantage of this therapy is to reduce toxicity, number one, in a number of sites. And there I would like to mention that it is applicable for reducing toxicity in a number of sites, such as lung cancer, such as breast cancer. Left-sided breast cancer patients are likely to have radiation-induced heart disease, especially if they are obese, diabetic, hypertensive, and if we are giving radiation to the left side, especially after they've had chemotherapy, there is a possibility of having radiation-induced heart disease, and proton reduces toxicity. So similarly, it reduces the toxicity in a number of locations. On the other hand, it improves the outcome in a number of locations, such as, for example, liver cancer. In Japan, Korea, and China, the largest number of proton therapy treatments are actually liver treatments. So there, why is it being used in liver cancers? Because it reduces the possibility of damaging the liver. We can give a much higher dose, and that has been shown to improve the cure rates of this cancer. Similarly, skull-based cancers, cancers that lie high up in between the brain and the head neck area, that's the skull-based region. There again, proton therapy is used to improve the outcomes of treatment, and the cure rates may be as much as 20% higher when we use proton therapy as compared to normal radiation.
Okay. Now, with everything, there's always a bit of a downside or maybe some side effects as well. Are there any side effects or any negatives of this therapy as well?
So I have to say that one of the things that we have to understand is that it's not that there are no side effects. The same side effects that can happen with radiation can happen with proton therapy, but their intensity is less. So what would I say are some of the downsides of treatment? One is, of course, its access is limited. So for example, there are 700, I'm giving the reference of India, there are 700 plus radiation establishments or machines in the country. However, there is only one proton therapy unit, so access is a problem. The cost of therapy is a problem. We do expect that with further research, and the availability of single room units, the treatment will become more accessible. Though I have to mention here that the cost in India is about 1/3 to 1/5 that of the same treatment in the Western Hemisphere. So the cost in India is actually significantly less as compared to the treatment cost in, say, for example, the United States. And the third thing that I would say about this treatment is that it is very exacting. That means that there is very little margin for error, and it is very, very sensitive to any changes that might take place in the patient, such as weight gain, weight loss, such as a reduction in the size of the tumor or the change in the shape of the tumor. And therefore, it is very important for the treating team to stay on top of things. So that is definitely, I wouldn't call it a downside, but I would say that that is one thing that we have to be very, very particular about.
Right. Well, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and insight with regards to Apollo Proton Cancer Center as well as this treatment, the proton beam therapy. Thank you, Dr. Sapna Nangia, that was a senior consultant of radiation oncology of the Apollo Proton Cancer Center. Thank you for being with us, Doctor.
Thank you very much for having me.
And that winds up today's discussion segment of Business Today. Keep tuning in. We've got an update on the market segment coming up. Today we are joined with Johan Gunatilaka, an analyst at the Speeder Edge team at Userbase. Thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you for having me, Perera.
All right, let's start off with a discussion about blockchain technology and its applications.
Yeah, so basically in a nutshell, blockchain is kind of like a ledger that we use in accounting to basically record transactions. So incoming and outgoing transactions in accounting, you'd record it in the previous days in history, you'd record it in a book. But the ledger system that blockchain uses is basically a digital version of this. So all these transactions are recorded in chronological order. So say, for example, if you gave me 100 rupees, you would basically rely on this blockchain to record that transaction to make sure that you didn't give me more than you wanted to and I didn't receive more than you gave me, right? So in the current system, you would use platforms like PayPal, Visa, MasterCard as intermediaries for this transaction to basically make sure that there is no fraud being taken place. So that requires a middle party that you trust.
Okay.
So there is always going to be counterparty risk. So the value in blockchain technology is that it removes this counterparty risk by installing what is called a consensus mechanism. So what this is basically this ledger and all the transactions that take place on it, when they're recorded, there is a network of basically thousands, hundreds of thousands of what we call nodes, but it's easier to imagine them as computers basically, that look at the validity of that transaction and verify that it actually takes place. So essentially, you can't give me more than what you said, and I can't receive more. So basically, it verifies that the transaction has actually taken place. And then that event has been recorded in what we call blocks, and then the chain part is the chronological order, basically.
Right. Okay.
So when we look at applications of this technology, right, we need an incentive mechanism to make sure that all these computers in the network actually give up their computing power to actually keep the network running. So that's where we basically have cryptocurrency. And that's the incentive mechanism, because the people that run these computers, otherwise known as miners, are paid in newly minted cryptocurrency so that they have incentive to keep doing this.
Okay.
So that's basically where cryptocurrency and its use cases come about. So firstly, I think all the way over a decade ago is when Bitcoin first came into the picture, although many people wouldn't have heard about it a decade ago, but that's essentially what Bitcoin was, right? And over the years, recently, we've started to see more and more applications of this technology come about, especially with things like decentralized finance or DeFi. And DeFi has been blowing up over the last few years. As of now, the total locked value in DeFi projects is over $50 billion, right? And that has been over the course of just the last 5-6 years that this has happened. And that has been basically through the birth of what is known as Ethereum.
Okay.
It is also kind of similar in the sense that it is blockchain based, but the major difference is that it's a development platform. So that is basically used for things that are called smart contracts.
Right.
And these smart contracts can be used for things like loans, selling real estate, even digitally, insurance, digital insurance. So things that are based on paper processes that used to take weeks to accomplish, with smart contracts can be automated, and these things can be done in just a matter of minutes.
Right. Okay.
So the applications of blockchain technology have been ever expanding, really.
Right. Now, you mentioned Bitcoin, and you mentioned some other sources and other types of this cryptocurrency as well. What's the major difference between Bitcoin and some of these other
Yeah.
competitors?
So basically, like I said, Bitcoin is kind of the first to market.
Right.
Right. Right now, as of now, Bitcoin, more than just a currency and a unit for transaction, has been looked to as a bit of a speculative asset. Right. It's kind of like digital gold in a way, a store of value.
Right.
And people kind of look to these cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoin especially, as a way to hedge against things like inflation, as a store of value, especially during times where economic crises may happen and the value of different equities and other assets can fluctuate. So can Bitcoin, but it's sort of looked as a hedge for those things. And another benefit, I'd say, of Bitcoin is the fact that it's a limited supply. So basically, there is engineered scarcity, much like gold, which is why I made that comparison in the first place. So you're more or less ensured a certain value because, number one, there's energy consumption to create Bitcoin, because of that previous networking computing requirement that I mentioned during blockchain. So there is an energy consumption to keep that network running, right? So there's a cost involved to creating Bitcoin. And there's also a limited supply, which means that basically, depending on the demand, these miners that mint new Bitcoin won't sell under a certain price because of their cost, right? So that is Bitcoin in a nutshell. But then we have things like Ethereum, Solana, which are basically other types of blockchains. So Ethereum, like I mentioned, is basically a development platform. Think of smart contracts like the iPhone. When it first came out, it was basically meant to be a pocket computer, right? But it didn't really do the computing things very fast. It did what you needed in the palm of your hand, and the real value of something like an iPhone when it came out was the apps, right? And that's essentially what Ethereum and those other platforms are. The interoperability between them is the major value proposition. So you have all these decentralized apps, and they basically can be used for so many things. You've heard of NFTs. You've heard of borrowing and lending facilities, insurance, real estate. All those things are happening on the blockchain faster than ever, and people are seeing newer and newer use cases come about because of this technology.
Okay. Now, when it comes to digital technology as such, much like any technology, there are downsides and there are some cons when it comes to that technology. How does hacking work? Are there ways of preventing this? What's your take on this?
So when it comes to hacking, right, there have been quite a number of incidents in the last year actually. October was one of the worst months in history for hacks in DeFi. And the thing is, with things like smart contracts, the quality and the security of a smart contract is purely dependent on how well it's designed. And that is where the human element comes in. So it's not a fault of the technology per se, but it needs to be designed better. And the thing with any industry that is growing at such a rapid rate, you're bound to get these things that happen that are, in my opinion, in the long run better, because it makes the technology better and it breeds competition, and it makes the companies that are doing better focus on security. And security has been a huge element of this conversation as well, because you have companies like Elliptic, Fireblocks, they're raising billions in venture capital funding, and all they focus on is smart contract auditing and security within the blockchain. So that is a growing industry within blockchain as well. And yeah, so the scalability of these smart contracts is also an issue. You have companies like I mentioned, MasterCard, Visa, that have millions of transactions per second, right? And blockchains currently are only doing a few thousand, right? Ethereum recently upgraded its system to do a few thousand, and it sees it expanding to 100,000 in the next few years, but it's still behind in that sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to price drop volatility in cryptocurrency, what's your take on this?
Yeah, so that is, I think, a major problem that a lot of people have, especially sort of traditional investors who look at fundamental value and things like that. But I think it's important the way we frame this conversation. So if you look at Bitcoin, in 2021, it rose to $60,000 per Bitcoin, and it had a huge drop off of over 50%, right? But if you look at the higher time frames, right, for the last few years, Bitcoin has gone from a few thousand to where it is right now. So that is still a gain of many multiples, right? And yes, that is considered volatility, but you have to also understand why these things happened. For example, with the recent drop, that was when the federal government of the US raised interest rates to the point where it was many equities, bond markets also collapsed. And that is evident now when we look at big banks like SVB, Silicon Valley Bank, that have just gone under because of their investment in bonds. So there is a volatility aspect, but it is also correlated with a lot of other legacy markets, stocks, and there is also a fix to that within blockchain as well, which is called stable coins. And those are coins that are basically pegged to the value of a dollar. So you have things like USDC, USDT. USDC is also, Goldman Sachs is a part of the development. So you have companies that are sort of catering to that volatility aspect as well.
Right.
So yeah.
Okay. And do you see, apart from hacking and some of the other issues, do you see a lot of criminal activity happening as well?
So yes, this is basically one of the first key sort of concerns many people had with Bitcoin, because in the past, in 2010, 12, 15, there was criminal activity on the dark web where people used cryptocurrencies to exchange basically goods on the black market, right? But the thing that people need to understand is that cryptocurrencies, fundamentally blockchain technologies, are based on public ledgers.
Okay.
And these ledgers, every transaction, like I told you, is recorded. So you can see where any money goes, which wallet it goes to, right? So if you compare it with something like cash is the most anonymous form of exchange possible, right? There's no way to exchange it. So in my opinion, cryptocurrencies or blockchain technologies is more traceable than the fiat money system.
Okay.
So yes, there is a potential for criminals to use it, but it's about the same potential as the regular financial system.
Right. And are there any applications outside of business and individuals? Do you see governments using this technology as well?
So yes, there is one, I think, important thing that we can discuss, which is central bank digital currencies. So basically what that is when a central bank uses blockchain technology to digitize its currency. So for example, we're seeing applications of this in the Caribbean islands, and also some countries in Africa that are doing this on blockchain technologies. But there are a few pros. While there are pros, there are also a number of cons. Getting into the pros, I think it's very important. One of the major pros of blockchain technology is traceability, right? You have governments that are undertaking these massive projects worth millions and millions of dollars. One thing that blockchain technology can be used for is traceability. So say you and I, as citizens of the country, can see, okay, the government has dedicated this amount of funds to X or Y project. Have they actually gone and done that?
Right.
How much money has gone and who has received the money? So that's something positive that blockchain technology can be used for. Another thing would be, especially the supply of money. That's something that many governments have struggled with inflation and things like that. These things are all programmable, right?
Okay.
So we're trusting the government with that responsibility. So having CBDCs, for example, basically enables any government to have more control over the financial system, and that basically segues into what the con is. So depending on where you stand politically, this may or may not be a good thing, right? Giving a government so much power. Now, for example, China is running their sort of pilot project on the digital yen, and there's so many purposes that it could be used for. It could be used for credit reports, basically seeing what sort of political leanings you have, and then the government has control over your assets after that point, right? So it opens a lot of sort of systems that could be abused. And the thing is, this is all dependent on whether the government would want to use a public or private ledger. So if it's public, the government would have to give up a lot of control, right? It would be basically allowing people to see exactly where this money is going, and it's dependent on whether the government actually wants to give up that control or not, right? And that's basically the major thing with CBDCs. And that's why we're seeing a lot of interest around the world. But very few have actually committed to going the extra mile and sort of committing to this technology.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what are some of the predictions you have for this technology, maybe in the near future, in the foreseeable future?
So
what do you see?
I think, like I mentioned, with the state that it is now, there are a lot of improvements that are coming, right? Scalability is a huge one that I already previously mentioned, but there are many new competitors coming in that are challenging the established players like Ethereum, and that competition, I think, will lead to better and better projects. One thing also to look forward to is zero knowledge proofs. So that is essentially a system where you can have a transaction without actually exchanging any information.
Okay.
So someone, the computer or whatever program, can verify that a transaction has taken place without actually the exchange of information. I think the easiest way to explain it is with an analogy. Say, for example, if you're familiar with Where's Waldo, it's a children's book where you have to find this cartoon character in a sort of picture.
Yeah.
And basically what a zero knowledge proof is you can prove to me that you know where Waldo is without actually showing me where Waldo is.
Okay.
Right? It's essentially that, but in a program.
Right.
And this has many use cases. It can be basically used to prove someone's identity without actually sharing their social information. Like, say, for example, your passport, your criminal history, all can be verified without actually the person knowing your name.
Okay.
So there are many, many new sort of technologies that are being tested right now. And in my opinion, the future looks pretty bright for this technology. I think there's a lot of investor interest. We're seeing millions and millions of dollars in funding coming every day. And this is sort of in spite of so much trouble that there has been, right? There has been major crashes, there has been sort of liquidations of big crypto banks, right? And I think the market has decided on what is going to succeed, right? It's a very free market system. A lot of blockchain is based on markets, and the market has spoken, and it has said that most of the decentralization is useful.
Right.
And most of the projects that have become defunct are the most centralized projects, like FTX, for example, which is a major crypto institution that completely went bankrupt. The owner has been sort of extradited to the US and is undergoing criminal cases for fraud. So regardless of all of this, the industry has kept kicking. Bitcoin recently, with US banks, legacy banks being shut down, has seen a major rise in price because the market has basically spoken.
Right.
It's acted as an alternative to traditional finance.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that insight on blockchain technology, Bitcoin, and all of that. That was Johan Gunatilake, an analyst at the Speeder Edge team of Userbase. Thank you once again for being with us this evening.
Thank you, Prashant.
And that winds up today's episode of Business Today. Do join us next time as well. Till then, have a good night.